Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Keeping Up with JavaScript as a Full-Time Job. My name is Jeremy Osborn. I'm the Academic Director of Gymnasium, which you can find at thegymnasium.com. What do? We offer free online courses on topics such as web design, front-end development, user experience, yes, JavaScript, and much more. This webinar is the latest in our series of discussions with notable figures in the industry, and today I am joined by two esteemed professionals who fit that bill, Kevin Chisholm and Keith Peters. I'm going to do some formal introductions in just a moment, but first let's just talk a little bit about the format of this. I'll be chatting with Kevin and Keith for about 45 minutes, and then leaving around 15 minutes at the end to take questions from all of you attending. We have Catherine Weber in the background here, and she will be available for any technical support you might need. There is a Q&A or question and answer button in your webinar panel, so you can feel free to add those questions at any point, but just be aware, we're not going to be answering them until the end. Also, some of you have sent us some questions ahead of time, so when you registered, we asked people to send questions. So I'll be sprinkling those in throughout the webinar, and we'll spend some time on those as well. Now on to our guests. So we have Kevin Chisholm, a freelance front-end developer who splits his time between New York and Florida, specializes in object-oriented JavaScript and AngularJS. Over the years, he has consulted and worked on websites for a number of notable companies, including Consumer Reports, Time, People, Sports Illustrated, Travel and Leisure, ThisOldHouse.com, TD Ameritrade, and GreenMountainPower.com, among others. Kevin, welcome.
Hello, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And next we have Keith Peters, author, speaker, and developer based in Boston. In addition to working as a developer on web and native apps, Keith is the author of Playing with Chaos, Programming Fractals, as well as Strange Attractors in JavaScript, ActionScript 3, Animation Making Things Move, and is the co-author of HTML5 animation with JavaScript in the ActionScript 3.0 cookbook. Hey, Keith, how you doing?
Hey, Jeremy, how are you?
Good. So, welcome both of you, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the main topic, which is why keeping up with JavaScript is a full-time gig. And before we do that, I think it's always worthwhile to talk a little bit about vocabulary and terminology, make sure that we're on the same page. So I guess the first things first is, and I'm going to throw this out to Kevin. Here's your first quiz. Java. It's the same thing as JavaScript, right?
Let me think for a second. Actually, I think the answer is no.
Okay.
They are. There is a similarity, though. The first four letters, I believe, are the same.
Okay.
That's where I think the similarity ends. Java is a compiled language that is primarily a back-end language, and JavaScript is historically a client-side interpreted language. In the last several years, it has also joined the ranks of back-end language by a node, but the short answer is they are not the same thing.
Okay. So yeah, there's kind of this confusion there, and this probably is one of the biggest kind of entry-level confusions I see, and again, it's just this really unfortunate kind of marketing thing that JavaScript kind of inherited, or maybe less charitably appropriated the popularity of Java at the time. Ironically enough, of course, now JavaScript is much more popular and ubiquitous than Java in many cases. Okay, so that's a good start. So Java is not the same as JavaScript. We're going to start off with that. Some other terminology that people might run across is, again, if we're getting technical, JavaScript is really something called ECMAScript. Keith, can you take that one a little bit? Can you describe like what, the relationship between ECMAScript or JavaScript and kind of what that's all about?
Yeah, sure. As Kevin mentioned, JavaScript was created for the Netscape browser back like 20 years ago. And Microsoft started copying it and made their own thing called JScript, and they knew that other browsers would be making their own implementation. So they wanted to have a standard, something that could be the same across all browsers or any implementation. So they went to this place called the European Computer Manufacturers Association, it's ECMA, and they're a standards organization, so they submitted the standard for the language, and that defines what JavaScript is, like all the objects, all the functions, all the variables, and how it all works. And they're up to like 7 versions of it so far. The one that you'll currently see in most browsers is ECMAScript 5 or ES5, and there's 2 others, ES6 and ES7, which are gaining popularity, but they're not. All the features of those are not widely adopted. So those are kind of cutting-edge versions.
So for folks in the audience who, again, depending on your level of familiarity with other languages, we have HTML. Of course, you probably all know the terminology HTML5, and of course there's CSS, and many browsers support CSS3, but there's a CSS4 on the horizon. And so is this kind of similar? This is the same thing. It's like JavaScript is evolving, and they're adding new features to the language similar to HTML and CSS.
Yeah,
correct?
exactly. Things, new features come up, and things that people want, things that make things easier or more powerful.
Okay. So one of the things that I want to kind of throw out there, this is actually, so the topic of this webinar is, keeping up with JavaScript is a full-time job, and in many ways, what we're kind of starting from the assumption that JavaScript has become extremely popular, and at the same time, it's almost a victim of its own success because it's everywhere, and that gives you so many options and there's so many choices that it's actually a little overwhelming. So part of what we want to do here, and that overwhelming feel kind of creates some anxiety in folks. So that's kind of what we want to target here in the webinars and have this conversation about, what can you do to stay on top, and what should you be thinking of. And I actually got this email, and this is totally coincidental. So we had this rehearsal on Monday, and just yesterday, out of the blue, I got this email that I almost couldn't have scripted better from a friend of mine who is a UI and UX specialist. And he basically asked me this question. He said, "Hey, Jeremy, I do a lot of responsive app prototyping as a UX designer. Could you recommend a relatively easy, non-developer friendly JS framework for UX and UI? I know vanilla JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. I've messed around with jQuery, and I know of tools like Node, Angular, and a lot of other package sets of widgets out there like Skeleton, Bootstrap." And this is the key line here, but I don't really understand I don't understand which ones work best together, or even which ones I need. So to me, again, this is kind of the scenario here. We're seeing JavaScript, which kind of used to be the domain of, if you were a programmer or a developer, that was your world. But we're now seeing it in these other areas. So we're seeing UX and UI people using JavaScript. We're seeing charting people. People have to make charts and data visualization, use different frameworks for that. So this is kind of the main topic here. So let's just take a step back, though, and talk about, again, this vocabulary. We have core JavaScript library, or the core JavaScript language, but then we've got frameworks and libraries. So let's kind of talk about that a little bit. Perhaps the most popular one is jQuery. I think that's the one a lot of folks are familiar with. So, Kevin, I know that you come up with a course called the JavaScript and jQuery Survival Guide. So why don't you take that one and talk just a little bit about what jQuery is, and just make sure that we're on the same page there.
Sure. So jQuery is a JavaScript library that was developed roughly about 8 or 9, 10 years ago by a gentleman named John Resig, and it is a collection of JavaScript that is well written and well tested. And I say that to say that some people might think that jQuery is something different in some version of JavaScript or some feature set of JavaScript that you wouldn't normally have. And the way I kind of try to describe it to people is to think of JavaScript, pure vanilla JavaScript, as the English language, every word there is, and you could write any sentence that you like. But jQuery is a library, so it's a collection of sentences and well-formed paragraphs that you can use to kind of construct your document, so to say. So it's a library that, on the high level, really initially its focus was to smooth out the differences between browsers. When it first came out, there was the differences between browsers were I'd say significant, and they made writing JavaScript applications very difficult and tedious because you had to constantly determine, is the browser IE, is it Firefox, is it Chrome, and if so, implement something differently. And jQuery provided you a very, in my opinion, a very simple and elegant set of methods that allow you to just say, I want to do something. I want to add an event handler, or I want to animate something, and jQuery under the hood would take care of all the tedium of determining which browser you're using, which feature set's available. So it's a library that provides a very well-written and well-tested set of methods for interaction with the browser.
Okay. So, and we're going to talk about some other popular ones a little bit later. So again, some of the names that I've already thrown out here are things like Angular, and I mentioned Node, which we'll talk about later, which maybe not one of those. But Keith, anything to add about like this definition of like the framework versus the library? Like, what are some of the benefits, or how do you approach or talk about either frameworks or libraries in general?
Yeah, I think it's good to see what the difference is between a framework and a library. Now, something like jQuery, it's a library because it's like kind of going to the library. You can pick out this book, you can pick out that book. You can do whatever you want with it. You can use one piece of it, or you can use a whole bunch of it. And you can write your application or your web page however you want using these bits and pieces. Where something like a framework is more like the word, it's a framework of a house. It really defines how the house is going to look, how it's going to be shaped, where the rooms are. And a code or JavaScript framework really defines how your application is going to work. What are the different parts of the application going to be? How are they going to talk to each other? Where is the data going to be saved? So when you use a library, you're kind of you're making available to yourself different pieces of functionality. Whereas if you're using a framework, you're getting a whole lot of built-in functionality, but you're also kind of tying yourself down to a particular way of working. So there are trade-offs on both.
And why? And just to follow up on that, Keith, like so why are there so many? Why are they popular? When if you go and do a search, for example, my friend here who perhaps goes and does a search for prototyping JavaScript library or something like that, and might get a list of 10, 20, 30. Why are there so many out there, and who makes these?
Yeah, I think it's one of the problems of web development right now is that everyone wants to make their own framework. Mm-hmm. Everyone wants their own library. So you have this like explosion of different technologies out there around JavaScript and the web. Mm-hmm. So I think people make them because they're using one and they find some things that they don't like about it, and they get really involved in it, and they decide they can do better, so they release another one, and they promote it as being better, and people jump on board, and that one gets popular for a while. So it's kind of this ongoing cycle.
But I think it's also kind of a good problem because I think part of the motivation is exactly what you said, Keith. Somebody might say, Angular's great, but I think I can do it better, and they create Aurelia or Vue, and it can create the kind of anxiety and confusion we're discussing today. But it's also the reason why frameworks such as Angular and React exist, because somebody said, I like A, but I think I can do it better. So it's a great problem, but it's a problem, but it's a good problem, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Wild West of,
right.
It's a little bit of chaos, but things are coming together slowly, and civilization's moving in.
Right. Yeah, I guess the idea there is that the cream will rise to the top, right? So it's like if someone builds a better mousetrap, right? It's like if you come up with something that people want to use, then that's a good thing. I guess the dilemma that a lot of folks run into, or maybe one of the things that people in the audience should understand, is that, as Keith and Kevin are saying, that anyone can make one of these frameworks and libraries. They can create a collection of code and put it up on GitHub, for example. And there is a downside to that as well. If there's just one person creating these frameworks or libraries and you use this in your project, Um, one of the benefits in theory is that someone is updating that code as needed, as time goes by and as browsers develop. In theory, that framework of that code that you used in your project would be updated, but that's not always the case, right? In other words, there have been a number of projects that people have used, and then that code gets abandoned for various reasons. So that kind of turns to something like Angular, and we'll throw this at Kevin because you have worked quite a bit, and even kind of label yourself as an Angular developer. So talk a little bit about what Angular is and why you chose that, and and how you got into Angular to begin with, and is there just a single person behind this? Should we, should folks in the audience be worried that Angular is going to disappear in a week or a year?
Sure. Well, Angular was originally developed by a gentleman named Misko Hevery. I think he worked at a company called Brat Tech originally, and somehow that got wrapped up into Google. But it's officially supported by Google. It's a Google project, and it's officially supported by them. So I think that, to answer your question about the concern about investing in it, I'm not sure if you can do much better than that. It's championed and maintained by Google, so I'd feel pretty comfortable if a client asked me that question. I'd say you're pretty good with Angular. As far as what it is, it's a framework, a JavaScript framework that is, I would say, I'm tempted to use the word extremely. I'll confidently use the word very opinionated about how you do things, but
okay.
The payoff there is that I think when you're working with Angular, you spend very little time deciding how to do things, and you spend most of your time doing things, because it is opinionated. So there are ways that you architect the application, organize your code, and then implement things. And so little of that requires decision that you really just kind of jump into your implementation code. And also that because of that, when you commit your code, another developer comes along who may not have an opportunity to speak with you, it's pretty easy to understand what you're doing and how you did it, because so much of it is opinionated. As far as how I got into it, I was very fortunate because I had an opportunity where I was working for Time Inc., and my team leader had asked me to rebuild a very old application. And when I say old, I mean I think it was built in 1998 or 99. That was built using iframes, literally, and but it was a revenue generator. And it was very valuable to them, and the relationship had kind of soured with the vendor, and they needed to update it. And they said, "We'd like you to rebuild it in Angular." And he said, "Are you familiar with Angular?" I said, "I've heard of it. I have not worked with it." And they said, "Would you like to build us with Angular?" And I said, "As long as you understand what I just said." And they said, "Sure, it's got to be done in 3 weeks. If you think you can deliver, go ahead." And luckily, I did. At the very last second, there's a lot of late nights, but it was a great opportunity to learn it, but in a real-world context. I had that kind of good motivation where I wasn't just watching tutorials. I was saying, how the heck am I going to get this done? I need to understand how this works. So it was a good kind of kickoff for me to really get some experience with it. And then since then, I've been a fan. I think Angular is very well done, and that was Angular 1.3, I think. I'm working with Angular 2 now. But it's an excellent framework.
So just to kind of be clear that you transferred yourself from like a JavaScript developer into an Angular developer. It took you roughly 3 weeks, but again, it was pretty. Would you say that was an easy transition or a difficult one?
Well, I would say that I wouldn't say it was an either or. Meaning, I think the way I kind of look at it is I think I kind of added that to my list of things I know how to do or have 3 weeks experience with.
Right.
But it was difficult. I think the hardest thing about it was not so much learning the syntax. I mean, there's still things about Angular that I have to look up on Google, but it's the way of thinking. And I think that every framework or library will have that learning curve. But with Angular, I think it's pretty steep. Even with Angular 1X, it was just a way of doing things that I must admit I spent some time staring at the screen saying, what? And that was the hardest part, But I still consider myself a JavaScript guy, but Angular, where I spend a lot of my time.
Right. And so, Keith, to kind of follow up on that, I mean, you and I have talked about, and it's almost kind of a bit of a running joke in terms of, we get, there's questions like, oh, should I learn Angular? And it's like, well, it depends, right? I mean, it's not right. So not all frameworks are right for every project, and in fact, that's part of the dilemma. In terms of, and I guess part of the question is like, how do you start thinking about where to spend your time, and where to invest your valuable resources and time in learning something new. And in Kevin's case, it was pretty straightforward. Someone's like, here's a project, it's something that makes money and we need it, done. That's not always the case, right? Sometimes people, if you're a freelancer, you might have some couple weeks of time on your hands. Mm-hmm. And so, there's all these temptations out there for where you should spend your time. But like, I'm curious about your thoughts on that. Like what's the highest payoff? Where can people?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways of looking at it. One is, you might have been hearing a buzz about some new language or framework or whatever, and it might be interesting. Maybe your friends are using it, some colleagues, and you want to go check it out. You've heard some good things about it. I mean, that's nothing wrong with that. Especially if people are talking about it, it's probably a good thing to do. Another, I think, really great pragmatic approach is like, what are you trying to do? If you're trying to get a job in the field as a JavaScript developer, go on to some of the job boards and see what companies are looking for. Are they looking for Angular developers? Are they looking for React developers? Is there a particular place you want to work? That what are they using? And that's one great thing about JavaScript. Like, you can just go onto a site and look at the source and see what they're using.
Right.
So you can do a little research, see what people want and where you want to be, and that'll give you a pretty good idea of what you should learn.
Right.
The other thing is, if you want to do a project for yourself, then it's really, it's a wide open field. And again, you go back to what you're interested in.
Right.
And like we were talking the other day, it's really important, or a really good idea, to just decide on a project that you want to do for yourself.
Yep.
Decide on a technology that you're going to do it with, and build it. Just research it, learn about it, build it.
Yep.
And you learn. Maybe you find, wow, this framework or this technology I'm using is not at all suited for this. It's way too simple. My application is way too complex. I needed something heavier. Or you'll see the other option where, like, this is way too overcomplicated for what I need to do. This is a really simple app, and this framework I'm using is just ridiculously complex. So, and you've learned now. You've learned about that framework and what it can do and what it's good for, and then you move on.
Yeah, and I guess it's worth pointing, and this kind of gets to the punchline a little bit early, but in Gymnasium, program director Andrew Miller and myself kind of have a very opinionated take on things, and we even when we were coming up with names for your course, Keith, we basically put a subtitle in there called Stop Faking It and Learn JavaScript for Real. And the reason for that is because we had kind of encountered that something like, again, going back to jQuery, in many ways jQuery was designed and is a phenomenal language. It does a lot that's great. In some instances, it almost felt like you could take a shortcut to doing some powerful things on a web page. So for example, if you wanted to create some sort of like an accordion menu on your page that opens and closes when someone clicks on a button, writing that from scratch in JavaScript is going to be kind of a hassle, maybe 20, 30, 40 lines of code. In jQuery, you could do that with 1 or 2 lines of code.
Right.
And so for a while, it almost felt like there were a lot of folks out there who kind of skipped the line a little bit, right? They could do some important and necessary things in jQuery, but if you were to dig a little deeper and talk about the fundamentals of JavaScript, then all of a sudden maybe that falls apart a little bit. They don't really understand what's happening.
Right.
And so I think that, again, that's kind of, to all of these questions, or I shouldn't say all of them, but for many of these questions, the answer is like, well, make sure that you know the fundamentals of JavaScript, and that's going to benefit you no matter what.
Yeah.
Now, again, for my friend, for example, who was asking about the UX and UI prototyping software, it's going to depend on each case. It wouldn't hurt him to learn more core JavaScript, but depending on what he needs to do, the UX JS framework that he uses might be fine or worth spending his time on. So again, I mean, so going to Kevin, I mean, in your course, we talk about JavaScript in jQuery, and that's a survival guide. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that course and kind of like what are some of the things that people might learn in there.
Sure. Well, with that course, when you and I were originally discussing it and kind of fleshing out the ideas, my thought process was, if you're really new to JavaScript and you're watching courses and reading books and you're getting that feeling of like, okay, I'm reading a lot of stuff, but how does this translate to my day job in terms of what things I will actually do as a front-end web developer? The chapters in the course reflect tasks that I feel are very common, especially in the beginning when you're doing front-end web development. They don't fade away, but they're ones that they'll hit you right away. And I try to address those in a very real-world sense, meaning instead of spending too much time on the low-level theory, let's talk about, hey, we want to add an event handler and we want to remove an event handler. So how do we do that? How do we unbind an event handler? So that was kind of my perspective on the course, was the initial, let's say, dozen or so things that as a front-end web developer, specifically with JavaScript, I'll probably have to do, how to do them, but also understanding what's happening, not just copy-paste, not just memorize, but understanding what the word this means inside of a method and why that's so important and so powerful. So trying to have a balanced, not too much digging in deep, but also not too much surface, and hopefully people walk away feeling, I learned how to do a dozen things, but I also understand how they work and why they work.
Right. And I think that that's kind of our approach, again, with like, if you think about this anxiety and, keeping up with technology, I always like to separate things into, what you can control and what you can't control. And what I feel, my opinion is, it's hard to control the market or the buzz around these different technologies, right? We know that different frameworks are going to come out. We know some of them are going to stay, some of them are going to leave, some of them will become popular, some of them won't be. But at the root of it, what you can control is, well, it's always JavaScript at its core. So that's a pretty smart place to focus. And so Keith, I'm kind of wondering too, like your background, like you, correct me if I'm wrong, but you kind of started in like traditional computer science and programming, and there's a lot of kind of core concepts there that apply, but for a long time you worked in Flash and that had ActionScript. So I'm kind of curious if you can talk a little bit about like that transition of like, well, okay, here is this programming language called ActionScript, and at a certain point you kind of made that transition to JavaScript. I'm curious, like, to hear your take on that.
Yeah, sure. I actually don't have a really strong computer science background.
Okay.
For a number of years, I studied as kind of a hobby, and then a friend of mine was doing some Flash work back in the late 90s and asked me to help, and I jumped on board and learned it really quick, and we made a lot of really horrible websites. But, okay, so you have Flash, which is an animation tool for creating animations on the web. Originally, that's what it was, and they added this language to it called ActionScript, which is a way to script elements, to like move things around or change the colors or shape or whatever, do all kinds of things using this scripting language. And ActionScript is actually based on ECMAScript, so it's extremely similar to JavaScript, the syntax and everything. So as time went on, I got pretty heavily into Flash, but then after a while, the writing was on the wall that Flash's time was diminishing, and
Mhm.
a lot of the stuff that you had to do in Flash when I started out in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was just no way to do some of this
Right.
dynamic animation interaction with HTML alone. You started being able to do that, and with like Canvas, you could do 2D drawing, and even
Mhm.
WebGL now you can do 3D stuff, and all the real-time live interaction AJAX stuff that Flash was really, it was a good stopgap for. Now you can do it all in the browser. So Flash's days became kind of numbered, and I started looking around, and well, the obvious thing to do is to jump over to JavaScript because
Mhm.
the languages are so similar. So yeah, that's my story.
And would it be fair to say, so in many ways there's similarities, and I think again the things that um, kind of stymie people is, there's a whole notion of, debugging, right, and troubleshooting, and like all of that stays the same no matter what you're doing. If you're using the latest version of a shiny framework, or if you're just doing basic JavaScript, there still are these common concepts of, you know, you got to figure out what's broken and how to fix it. And
Yeah.
some of that involves logic, and some of it is just kind of persistence, right? So in many ways, I kind of feel like that also is another answer to this key of like, how do you keep up? Well, some of it is just, your problem solving skills, right?
Yeah,
Just
totally.
putting yourself in scenarios where you have to solve a specific problem.
Yeah. Well, those you don't
Yeah,
really
go
have to
ahead.
put yourself in those. Those situations will make themselves available to you.
This is true. Yeah,
That's
this is
taking
true.
it
You don't have to look very far for that.
generally.
Um,
At least I don't.
well, and that kind of leads to another piece again and this is something that came up in a lot of the questions that we got when people registered here. And again, this speaks right to this notion of anxiety and keeping up, and feeling like this stuff is hard to learn, and it pairs directly with math, right? So math actually brings, I think there's even a term called like math anxiety, right? And you know, for me, for example, I was not a particularly good student of math in high school, and I think I maybe took a logic course in college, but that was about it. Maybe statistics. Um, those are what I needed to graduate, of course. So, but for a lot of people, there's this concept that if they're going to be getting into programming or developing, if they're going to be learning JavaScript, if they're going to be learning jQuery or Angular, that math is a huge part of that. So I'm kind of curious to um, explore that a little bit, because I think that again that has something to do with this notion of trying to keep up. Should you go and take a math course somewhere? Should you take an algebra course or a calculus course? Do you need that before you start, JavaScript or jQuery? So let's turn that over to Kevin again. What about you? What was your background and career as a math student?
Can I plead the fifth on that one?
Okay,
Uh,
fair enough.
oh, it was. I
You
mean,
just answered it.
yeah, it wasn't good at all. And but in fact, ironically, I had a friend during the '80s who was in college who was a computer science major, very, very good friend, and we used to get together and hang out. And I was studying music, so I was, my mind was in a different place. And he used to say to me all the time, "You should get into computers," and I thought that was like saying you should get into neurosurgery or something. I thought you don't get into computers, you study it formally, and certainly a guy like me with horrible math skills, it's not going to happen. And he I remember said to me a number of times, I don't think you get it. There could be math in there, but the most important thing is understanding abstract concepts, and I think you do. And I think particularly because you're a musician, you get it. You get abstract thoughts, and I for the longest time I just didn't listen to him. I thought, well, that's just crazy. You're wrong. And okay.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out that when I got into computers, which was really just kind of by accident, that's exactly what I found the case to be. It was really more understanding abstract concepts that I think helped me to jump into something I had no training in whatsoever and was making a living at it in months. And it boggled my mind, but it really surprised me that, and I'm not saying there isn't any math involved, or there won't be, and there certainly could be, certainly if you're getting into more system and back-end development. But I think in particular front end in JavaScript, it's more understanding abstract concepts, feeling comfortable with where aesthetics meet programming, and those kinds of things I think are kind of harder for people. The math part, it doesn't really concern me too much. It's more just kind of having a good imagination. It may sound strange, but I think that's a really big part of it, especially working with front-end development.
Okay. And so, Keith, same kind of question. And again, we have to preface this with, you're the author of a website called Coding Math, which folks can actually go and check out. I actually highly recommend they go check it out. It's a great site, a series of videos and tutorials that talk about, creating different, both visual effects, but some other stuff. So clearly, math is a part of what you do, but I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I agree a lot with what Kevin is saying, is that not so much, the ability to manipulate numbers per se, but the idea to get concepts, and also I think to think logically. Those are more key than math. But again, it depends what you're doing. If you're going to go into game programming, for example, there's a ton of math involved in that. There's just no getting around it. And all the physics and moving things around, and there's a lot of things in game development that are just pure math. Also, I think if you're getting into a lot like animation or even user interface animations and interactions, sometimes you get some math in there. And then a few other minor areas, but in general, I think writing apps, there's not a whole lot of math involved, and mostly you don't really need to quote unquote be good at math, because the computer is going to do the math for you. It's not like you're going to be tallying sums of numbers or doing square roots. You just call the square root method and it gives you the square root. So again, it's just knowing how to think about it, thinking logically, thinking in the concepts of what you need to do and how that math will apply to your project, and then letting the computer do it.
So it seems like kind of a lot, and this is a similar theme, I think, even in the more traditional front-end languages like HTML and CSS. It's like half the battle is kind of knowing like what the question is and almost like what you're trying to solve, right? And like forming the question is almost as important as the answer. And some of that just happens through experience. But so maybe let's turn to that again, like when it comes to your own personal anxieties, when you're dealing with like a project and you've hit a wall, what resources do you turn to? Is it all in your head? Do you have like a book next to you? Are there websites that you like to use? So when you're facing your own particular, flavor of stress or whatever you want to call it, in dealing with something new, like where do you turn to? Kevin, why don't you take that first?
Sure. Well, I think that web search is always the first step. I mean, for me, I don't even pretend to try to memorize everything. And there are certainly some things I know off the top of my head, and it's mostly through to repetition. But when I hit a wall, I do a search, and I would say probably the majority of the time it's a Stack Overflow article, and I wonder sometimes how any developer or engineer could live without Stack Overflow. But it also amazes me that sometimes the answer to a really difficult problem I might find on some obscure, bizarre, outdated blog from 2007 that just happens to have the answer. So you never know where it's going to come from. It's out there, but I think that to me, the ability to search well, to kind of know how to search for things and how to understand search results and quickly drill down on the search results you find is, I think, possibly more important than trying to memorize everything. When you don't know anything about a language, you certainly want to learn the days of the week and how to say hello and goodbye. But after that, it's more important to sort of feel comfortable saying, there's going to be things I'm not going to know. There's going to be days where I simply cannot solve a problem, and let me do a search. And some people like to participate in forums and groups and things like that. I find that probably 98% of the time, searching gets me where I need to go.
Okay, Keith, what's your take on that? What's your kind of process?
Yeah. If I'm just in the middle of something and it's something I don't understand, 99% of the time it's Google, and 99% of the time it goes to Stack Overflow. an amazing. I don't know why I just don't go there first.
Uh-huh. Right. It's like you rely, like Google has to be the middleman. It has to,
Google's
you
the
need the
front end,
verified.
Stack Overflow. That's what they are.
Right.
Yeah.
But if I'm, using a particular technology, like right now, currently I'm doing a lot of stuff with Google Chromecast. Now, Google's documentation is really great, and
Right.
A lot of the libraries or frameworks or whatever, they'll have documentation, and some of it's okay,
Yeah.
some of it's horrible, some of it's
Yeah.
non-existent. But Google is generally really great. So if you're using any of their stuff, um, and they'll list out not only like tutorials on how to do certain tasks, how to build a whole application, but they'll list out their whole API or application programming interface, which is all the objects, all the classes, all the methods, what the methods are called, what they take. So that's really useful. And if I want to learn a new language, I know I'm maybe kind of unique in this. I know not everyone agrees, but I like just getting a basic beginner book on it,
Mm-hmm.
and just sitting down next to my computer and going through the book. A lot of times I don't even finish the books, but
Yep.
I'll get like maybe a third or the halfway through it, and
Mm-hmm.
I'll be like, okay, I get the concept, I get
Right.
how this works. Maybe I'll check in some of the future chapters and
Right.
have some
Now,
specific
talk
applications
to
of
me
it.
a little bit about these things called books. Are these a new? Is this a new framework? Or oh
Yeah,
wait,
they were invented by Amazon. Um,
Something, something I'll also mention, Jeremy, something that's actually helped me a few times when I've really, really been in a tough spot is sometimes I'll do a search on GitHub, and I
Okay.
say that I'll give you an example. I had to upgrade for a client of mine the version. We were working Angular 2 application, but we were on beta. So let's just say we were on beta 5, and we had to go to beta 9. So it was a huge jump. I mean, it was a lot of breaking changes, and they were just a number of things that were not out there, and they certainly weren't in the Angular documentation. And I was really at a wall, and I did a search on GitHub, and I found some kind of sandbox playground repos that people had made that literally they were saying, hey folks, in case you're trying to get Angular Beta 2.8 working with routing and subroutes, here's something that I did that worked, and it was huge. I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
literally saved me hours of work. So I'll just mention that sometimes searching specifically in GitHub,
Right.
you have to kind of, the repo has to have the name. It's not going to search the entire repo for
Okay.
one line of code that you mentioned. But if you kind of think in terms of, let me find a repo with these words in it, sometimes it can really be a goldmine.
Okay. And I know in past conversations, and I use this in some of the courses that I've done, and I believe we referenced this, but the Mozilla Developers Network
Yeah.
is a great place just for like the straightforward syntax, right? So like the ABCs of the language, really kind of just like their formatting and like their ability to search and to uh, look up
Yeah,
terms and
they
so
also
forth.
have a lot of similar to what I was saying about Google, like they have more tutorial-based stuff as well, like
Yeah, that's
how
true.
to use some feature, how to program an app of a particular type that uses,
Yeah, so some give you some hands-on experience
yeah,
with
as well
actual
as
projects.
documenting each and every object and method.
Yep.
We're about to drift into the question and answer period, but before we do that, I want to just talk about, again, at the risk of increasing anxiety or muddying the waters, it is kind of always interesting to me to ask folks like what are the things that they're looking forward to. So the future of JavaScript, and again, we had mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, the ECMAScript or ES um, versions, and there's versions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now we're seeing like 6 and maybe even 7 being um, talked about and discussed. So are there things in these future implementations that either of you are looking at or interested in, or kind of as a second part to that question, what about upcoming frameworks and libraries? Again, we haven't really gone into the details of things like Angular. Um, there are other ones out there that are very popular, like React, Backbone, but again, at its core, it's always just JavaScript. So Kevin, what sort of things are you looking at in the future? So maybe we'll frame this a different way. For folks in the audience who are pretty comfortable and maybe looking to upgrade their job skills, maybe find a new job, trying to position themselves, to be hired or enhance their portfolio, what sort of stuff might they be looking at, or again, are you looking at and thinking of down the road?
Sure. Well, in terms of pure JavaScript, I would definitely recommend becoming as familiar as possible with ECMAScript 2015. The caveat is that you can't use most of these features in a browser. A lot of them you have to write them in use a compiler, a transpiler such as Babel, and then maybe something like Webpack to do your build. But some of the features of ECMAScript 2015, such as arrow functions, classes, the REST operator, the spread operator, and particularly modules and generators, and the promise implementation are features that they're incredible, and they really take the language to a new level. Certainly when they come into the browser, I think it'll be a game changer. But being able to at least discuss those intelligently in an interview, I think, it makes you stand out. It makes somebody pay attention to you if you understand what these things are and what they bring to the language, and even if you can just discuss how to implement them, I would highly suggest it. There's ECMAScript 2016, which has some new features such as asynchronous functions and the await method, which kind of works with that in tandem. Those I'm really excited about. I mean, when that finally comes to the browser, I think it'll really change things. But that's kind of where I tend to spend my coffee sipping time in terms of just kind of upping my skills, and I'd recommend that to anybody.
Okay, excellent. Keith, what about you? What sort of things on the horizon are you interested in or think are worth exploring?
Yeah, I was actually going to say this similar to what Kevin said. In terms of the, ECMAScript 6 or 15 as we call it. It's nice that it has multiple different names.
Of course. That doesn't make it more confusing at all.
No. So ECMAScript 6 is ECMAScript 2015, is that right?
Yeah, ECMAScript 7 is 2016, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so, and as Kevin was saying, like, you need to use some other tools because most browsers don't run that stuff, so there's, you mentioned the two, like Babel and Webpack are tools that you can use to write in this newer cutting-edge syntax, and it will compile it down into current ES5, which is, will run in any browser. So I've been using those a lot in work projects. And the other one is reactive programming. So that's it's a new kind of paradigm. I don't know if it's new, but it's called functional programming, or functional reactive programming, and there's been libraries written for all kinds of languages, and they usually go by RX something. So RX Java, RX Python, I think, and they have RxJS.
Okay. And
it's a way of using functions as objects and not maintaining state. And it's very complex. I don't think I'm going to explain it.
Right.
But it's a very big and upcoming area that a lot of developers are moving over to. So if you want to kind of stay up on the new cool stuff cool kids are using, RxJS is a big one to learn. It will kind of do your head in because it's really a different way of thinking about how to accomplish things, but very interesting.
Okay, so that's a good piece of advice. So anyone out there who wants to dive into the deep end, go take a look at RxJS and see what pops up there. And then we'll take some questions in a second, but one of the things that we always like to do is kind of ask our guests about kind of one piece of advice that they would give to an upcoming or a entry-level front-end developer, someone interested in this territory. So you have kind of like a single piece of advice, and we might have touched on some of these things already, but so it's okay to repeat it. But Kevin, what would you generally say to folks who are looking for some guidance?
Well, I remember a long time ago I heard a saying that surfers are always looking for the ultimate wave, and they secretly hope they never find it. So I think that I kind of think of that in terms of learning any technology, particularly JavaScript these days, is that just sort of accept that it's a lifestyle, not really a something that's going to end at some point. You will not wake up one day and say, I've learned the 3 most important frameworks. I got JavaScript. I'm set. I'm kind of good to go. Because as we all know, it's going to change. So I think, kind of like we discussed earlier, learning how to find answers, learning how to learn, and I think also get to know yourself, understand how you learn. Because as Keith mentioned, some people like to just sit and read 400-page book from beginning to end and then dive in. And some people like to build something, just start building it, break it, see what happens, and then many people are in between. So learn how you learn best, learn where your comfort zone is for learning, and develop a process for how you learn new things. Because every time you learn something new, you'll kind of get more used to it, and just accept that it'll never end. And if that's okay with you, then it's a really exciting experience, because that's really the nature of anything technology related, but particularly JavaScript these days. It literally is the wild, wild west. So get your horse, get your gun, have fun.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's a fantastic piece of advice, because I think too often folks kind of either feel pressured, or they feel like, okay, well, the thing I have to do is that, I really need to go do this. Maybe it doesn't feel natural, right? So maybe, like, again, going back to what Keith said, maybe the way you learn best is with a book, sitting down and walking through the steps. Maybe the way you learn best is being put into a scenario where you're forced to produce, and so some people, are high performers there. So I think that's great. Keith, what about you? What sort of advice would you have?
Yeah, I think something I touched on earlier is, deciding on a project that you want to do, I think, is a really important way to learn a technology. Because you can read a book, you can read a tutorial, you can look at the API, you can do some examples, or you can even get a sample application and go through it. But all those things, they're a little bit contrived, They're like somebody has gone through to make this example, but they've worked out all the problems, and they're saying this is how you do it. And you can, oh, that's great. I understand it now. It's great. But when you go to build your own application, where all those problems aren't worked out, it's gonna hit you in the face, all the stuff you don't know, and you're gonna have to go find the answers, and maybe change what you wanted to build, because what you wanted to build is not possible or too hard for your level. But or maybe you can actually go and learn all the parts you need to make it work like you wanted to. But either way, you're going to learn a lot doing that, stuff that you never expected to learn. And that's going to benefit you when you go on a real job and have to build a real application, and somebody's standing behind you saying, when is it going to be done? You have that experience of you know how to work through those problems.
Excellent. Both excellent pieces of advice. So thank you. Okay, so we're going to turn to kind of a combination of questions that we got ahead of time, as well as some fresh ones that are popping up here. And again, I'm going to apologize in advance. We're not going to be able to hit every question. One of the things we have done in the past is we kind of send out we create a blog post on. So first of all, the first thing you should do is we have a Twitter feed, Gymnasium Tweets, and that will be the location for this video after it's done, so you can share that with friends and family and whoever you want. We also kind of will cycle back to some of these questions that we don't have a chance to get to, or might be too complicated to answer concisely. So having said that, we'll kind of start with a couple basic ones here. One is, I love jQuery, but I hear people say it's a performance hog. What do you think? I'll throw that over to Kevin. So jQuery, performance hog, yes or no?
I think the answer is no. It certainly could be, depending on how you utilize jQuery. But if you understand to a modest degree what you're doing, it does not have to be a performance hog at all.
Mm-hmm. But performance, so talk about, again, performance in just a little bit, because in my experience, what happens in some of where in general the workflow of best practices get kind of this is a good a good place for beginners in particular, or people who aren't really paying attention to the details to stumble a bit. You might have a home page on your website, and you're doing some special stuff there, maybe with a form or maybe with some animation, and so you include references to some JavaScript code to do a specific thing on that home page. But then you also include all those references on the other pages of your site. Of course, that's generally not a good thing for performance, right? So whenever you're requesting code from a server, that tends to slow down the performance. Mm-hmm. So again,
but I think the issue that possibly that kicks up this question is mm-hmm. people who use jQuery to write applications, and then possibly a manager comes along and says, hey, man, I know this page well, and it's a lot slower. And I think it comes down to things like not referring to the same selector more than once, get the selector and create a variable out of it and cache it, touching the DOM. People don't always understand that touching the DOM is super expensive, and that's where immediately your performance just nosedives. So if you were creating, let's say, an unordered list of, the 5 days of the week, instead of creating an unordered list in the DOM and then creating each list item and inserting it one at a time, create the entire unordered list and the entire contents of the unordered list in memory, and then shove it into the DOM. It's a one-time interaction. So I think when it comes to performance in jQuery, that's where usually people start to complain, and where managers might complain about somebody's code and make suggestions in the code review. And that's where I would tell someone to focus, is understand what you're doing and why it's not performing well.
Okay, fair enough. Keith, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to, we talk about jQuery lowering the bar to entry for developers, which is a great thing because then you have more developers able to make more things. But you also have inexperienced developers doing things that they don't know that they shouldn't be doing. So it kind of it gives you lots of rope to hang yourself with. So. Mm-hmm. It's just not bad, it's not good, it's just, if this is what you're going to be doing, realizing that it's a constant learning and a constant improving activity where you're always going to be learning new things and learning how to do things better.
Okay, fair enough. So let's look at some of the live questions, and again, I'm kind of going through these in real time, so there's a little bit of a lag here. But we'll start with a very basic one from Helen. So Helen asks, do you code alone? How important is it to find coding partners? Sounds like a pretty fair question. So, what's your workflow, Kevin?
Well, I think that this comes down again to getting to know yourself. I think that pair coding can be a very, very good practice. I mean, to me, if you think about it, two people attacking the problem, it's great to get other perspectives, and somebody may think of something that you didn't think of. So I'm not at all against pair programming. I tend to prefer to work alone, and that's not to say that anybody should. It's just I know myself, I know how I am, and that's where I'm usually happiest and most productive. Yeah. But I think that if somebody else were to say that they're more comfortable doing pair programming, I would say that's fantastic. It sounds like a great idea if it works for you, if it works for both people.
Okay, good enough. What about you, Keith?
Yeah, I do a lot of personal projects, and so I'm obviously working alone. And in my current job for the last few years, I've been working remotely, so I work by myself. I work in a company with other developers, but interference in the audio there, but okay. But yeah, in other jobs I have worked more closely. I've never done, what's technically called pair programming, where two developers sit down at one computer and one types and the other one talks and they work it back and forth. But I have, worked closely with other people on the same project, on the same code, and had code reviews. And for me, it's a little bit, it's kind of a bitter pill at first because you're like, I don't want to be criticized,
Right.
I don't want someone telling me what to do. But
right.
Once you get comfortable with it, it's really nice. Where you're like, somebody's like, oh, you could have done that better. And it's, oh yeah, you're right. That's great.
Right.
Thanks. And you learn, you get someone else's viewpoint.
Right.
It's really good if you do have that opportunity.
Yeah, I would think that it really does depend at that point on the chemistry and making sure that it's kind of in the spirit of like constructive criticism and like, all right,
you can have a bully or
right,
super opinionated, and that's not so fun.
Right. So we've actually kind of we really hit a couple questions there. I did sprinkle some throughout the webinar. So we're hitting 3 p.m. and I want to kind of respect everyone's time here. Before we, so I should first mention that we will again try to cycle back and get some of the questions that were loaded in the control panel that came from folks, and we'll address those kind of in a future blog post coming up. But before we completely sign off, I want to invite both our guests to talk about things that they might be doing down the road, whether it be some projects that they're working on or where you can find them, where you can get in touch with them. Let's start with Kevin. So Kevin, I know you've got your website, kevinchisholm.com, but what other sort of things are you doing, and do you want to talk about?
Sure. So my website's kind of more like an online business card, but where I spend most of my time is my blog, which is blog.kevinchisholm.com, where I write about pretty much everything front end. I focus a lot on JavaScript, but there's articles about CSS as well and HTML5. But I invite anybody to check it out. There's a lot of tutorials and videos. And then I just recently launched a new site called Front End Video. It's frontendvideo.org. And the focus of that site is very short, focused tutorials about front-end technologies. And right now it's focusing on JavaScript. But anywhere between 1 and 3 minutes tops video tutorials about a very specific skill or method that somebody might be trying to understand.
Nice. And for folks in the webinar right now, if you go down and look in your chat window, Catherine kind of put some links to some of the URLs that Kevin mentioned, and you can also find him on Twitter at Kevin Chisholm. So, and Keith, what about you? Anything that you want to talk about?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the coding math site, but actually probably more directly is just go to YouTube and look for coding math.
Yep.
And, so there's a whole bunch of videos that, the concept of the channel is the math that you need as a programmer. Beyond that, my website would be bit-101.com, and hopefully they'll get that in the chat. And that's basically a WordPress blog, so I'm involved in all kinds of other stuff, but it'll all be referenced from there.
Yeah, I would recommend for folks that, I was introduced to Keith many, many years ago when he was doing these kind of daily experiments in Flash, and he would kind of post like these really cool and wild things on his blog. And so now you've kind of been doing that as well, like recently, right? Just kind of posting like little experiments and kind of fun stuff that you've been coding on that Bit 101 site.
Yep.
And yeah, that I really recommend like that sort of thing. I think is just so useful. It's like so often when you're working on things, you kind of keep it on your computer or keep it in your head, or it just disappears. But publishing stuff and just getting it out there, there's really nothing wrong with it. In fact, I always recommend it. So that's pretty cool. And again, your Twitter handle is Bit 101.
BIT 101. The website has a hyphen in between the Twitter handle.
Bit-101.com. And that's in the chat as well, folks. So, all right, well, that's it for the webinar. I want to thank you guys for taking the opportunity to chat. And thanks, everyone, for attending. We will make a recording for this available in perhaps a week or two. And you'll get a notification of that, I believe, if you registered. I should make sure that that's correct. But at the very least, you can go to our Twitter feed and look at Gymnasium tweets, and we'll put a link up to there as well. I'm getting confirmation from Catherine that a recording will be sent via email, or a link to the recording. So that's that. And once again, thanks, everyone. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks again for taking part.
Thanks for having us.
Bye. Thanks for having me.
Take care.